What happens after a judge says the words, "death sentence"? Most people think the story ends there, but that's actually where the real battle begins. Behind prison walls, years of secret court filings, hidden evidence reviews, and last-minute appeals can change everything. Some cases take decades, some sentences are overturned, and some truths don't appear until it's almost too late. Tonight, we step inside the legal fight that begins when the courtroom goes quiet, and time itself becomes the biggest enemy. The courtroom was silent when the judge said the words that were supposed to be final, "sentenced to death." Every person in the room stopped breathing at the same time. Reporters lowered their pens. A deputy shifted near the door. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked loudly enough to sound like thunder. And then something strange happened. The woman standing at the defense table did not cry. She did not scream. She simply nodded once, as if she already knew this moment would come. Her name was Elena Ramirez, and according to the jury, she had committed one of the most shocking crimes the state had seen in years. The verdict had arrived after weeks of testimony, months of investigation, and years of fear in a small California town. The judge struck the gavel. Case closed. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. Because what almost nobody in that courtroom understood was this: the sentence was only the beginning. And before the sun set that same day, Elena's lawyer would discover something buried deep inside the case file, something that could stop the execution entirely. But first, we have to go back. 10 years earlier, Elena Ramirez lived a quiet life. She worked nights as a medical billing clerk in Riverside County. Her apartment sat above a small grocery store that smelled like bread every morning. Neighbors described her as polite but distant. She rarely attended parties. She rarely spoke about her past. People remembered her for one thing: she listened more than she talked. Detective Aaron Hale first heard her name during what seemed like an ordinary investigation. A local business owner had been found dead in his office after closing hours. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious struggle, just unanswered questions. At first, investigators believed it was a robbery gone wrong, but nothing had been taken. Security cameras showed only one visitor that evening, a woman who entered calmly and left 20 minutes later. The image was grainy, but clear enough. Elena Ramirez. When police questioned her, she appeared calm. Too calm, some officers later said. She admitted visiting the office, but claimed it was about paperwork connected to a medical debt dispute. She insisted she left while the victim was alive. There were no eyewitnesses proving otherwise. For weeks, the case stalled. Then forensic analysts made a discovery that changed everything. A trace piece of evidence connected Elena to the scene in a way prosecutors argued could not be explained by coincidence. Investigators began rebuilding the timeline, hour by hour, minute by minute. Media coverage exploded. News stations called it a mystery. Commentators debated motives. Some portrayed Elena as a calculated planner. Others questioned whether investigators were rushing toward a single suspect. The trial became a national story. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors described a deliberate act driven by personal conflict. The defense argued the investigation ignored alternative explanations and relied too heavily on interpretation instead of certainty. Jurors listened to experts discuss timelines, digital records, and forensic conclusions that sounded scientific but confusing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Finally, the jury returned. Guilty. The sentencing phase followed the part of the trial many viewers never fully understand. Lawyers presented Elena's childhood history, mental health evaluations, and personal background. Prosecutors emphasized responsibility and the seriousness of the crime. The jury faced a heavy decision: life imprisonment or death. When they chose death, the courtroom felt frozen in time. And that brings us back to the moment after the gavel fell. Most people believe a death sentence means an execution date comes next. It doesn't. In fact, the legal process becomes far more complicated. As deputies escorted Elena away, her defense attorney, Michael Grant, gathered stacks of paperwork from the table. Grant was a quiet man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had spent 25 years working capital cases. He knew something the public didn't. Every death sentence triggers an automatic appeal. No matter what, Within days, the trial transcripts were sent to a higher court. Judges who had never met Elena would now examine every decision made during the trial, jury selection, evidence rulings, expert testimony, even the wording of instructions given to jurors. Grant explained it simply during a later interview. "The system double-checks itself," he said, "because the punishment cannot be undone." Meanwhile, Elena entered death row. Her new world was smaller than anyone imagined. A single cell, limited movement, strict schedules, long hours alone with thoughts that never seemed to quiet. Days blended together, but outside the prison walls, the case was far from finished. Appellate lawyers specialists who focus only on appeals began reviewing thousands of pages from the trial. Their job was not to retry the facts, but to ask a different question. Was the law followed perfectly? If even one serious legal error existed, the sentence could change. Months later, Grant received a call from the appellate team. They had questions about forensic testimony presented during the trial, not proof of innocence, but questions. And in death penalty cases, questions matter. The appeal argued that certain expert statements may have sounded more certain than science allowed. Prosecutors pushed back strongly, insisting the trial had been fair and the evidence reliable. The state Supreme Court agreed to review the case. Years passed. The public slowly forgot Elena's name. News cameras disappeared. Headlines moved on to new stories. Families healed or tried to. But inside legal offices, attorneys continued writing briefs longer than novels, debating legal standards most people never hear about. Meanwhile, Elena waited. Every morning began the same way: metal doors opening, counts conducted, meals delivered through a slot. She read books constantly. Law books became her favorites. She wanted to understand the system deciding her future. One evening, a correctional officer told her something quietly. Most people here wait decades. She didn't believe him at first. Then she learned the truth. After state appeals come federal reviews. Federal courts examine whether constitutional rights were violated. Each stage can take years. Sometimes courts send cases back for hearings. Sometimes they deny relief entirely. And after that comes clemency, a final request asking a governor to reconsider the sentence. The process moves slowly because every decision carries enormous weight. Outside, Detective Hale followed updates from afar. He had long since moved to another division, but the case stayed with him. Something about it never felt finished. Not doubt exactly, just unfinished. Then, nearly 8 years after the sentencing, the appellate court issued its ruling. The conviction would stand, but the judges noted concerns about one narrow part of the sentencing phase. The decision ordered a new review hearing. Not freedom, not exoneration, but another chance. For the victim's family, it reopened wounds they believed had closed. For prosecutors, it meant preparing arguments again. For Elena, it meant hope fragile and uncertain. Michael Grant reopened old boxes from storage, dust-covered files no one had touched in years. As he reread witness statements, something caught his attention. A detail so small it had barely been discussed during trial. A timestamp. One that didn't seem to match another record. Grant frowned. He checked again, then again. If the records were correct, someone's timeline, prosecution or defense, had been wrong from the beginning. And if the timeline was wrong, the entire sequence of events might need to be re-examined. Late that night, Grant called the appellate investigators. "I think we missed something," he said. Silence filled the line. "What kind of something?" Grant stared at the documents spread across his desk. "The kind," he whispered, "that could change everything." Outside, rain tapped against the office window as he compared files side by side. 2 official records, same night, same location, different times. Only one could be true. And if the newly discovered timestamp was accurate, Elena Ramirez might not have been where prosecutors said she was when the crime occurred. Grant leaned back slowly, realizing what this meant. The case everyone believed was settled might be starting over. And somewhere inside the prison, unaware of the discovery unfolding miles away, Elena sat alone in her cell as the lights dimmed for the night. Waiting, not knowing that by morning, a single piece of overlooked evidence would reopen the fight between life and death, and force the courts to confront a question they feared most. What if the system had made a mistake? The letter arrived just after sunrise. A correctional officer slid it through the metal slot in Elena Marquez's cell door without saying a word. The envelope looked ordinary, thin, official, stamped with legal markings she had learned to recognize over the years. Most letters brought bad news. Denials, delays, more waiting. Elena stared at it for a long moment before opening it carefully along the edge. Inside were only 2 pages. But those 2 pages changed everything. Her attorney, Michael Grant, had written just one sentence in bold near the top. "We found a timeline discrepancy that may affect the conviction." Elena read it 3 times. Her hands trembled slightly, though her face remained calm. Years on death row had taught her how to hide emotion. Hope could be dangerous here. Hope could disappear overnight. Still, something felt different. For the first time since sentencing, the case was moving forward, not backward. Across the state, Grant's office looked like a storm had passed through it. Boxes covered the floor. Trial transcripts stacked in uneven towers. Sticky notes marked pages filled with technical language only lawyers seemed able to decode. Grant wasn't alone anymore. A new appellate investigator, Dana Liu, had joined the case. She specialized in reviewing digital evidence, phone records, surveillance logs, and timestamps that often went unnoticed during trials. She leaned over a computer screen, replaying archived data again and again. "Look at this," she said. Grant walked closer. 2 timelines appeared side by side. One came from the prosecution's original case, showing Elena leaving the office building at a specific time that placed her alone with the victim during the estimated window of death. The second timeline came from building security server backups recovered years later during a routine data audit. The exit time was different, not by hours, by minutes. But those minutes mattered, because if Elena exited earlier than prosecutors claimed, she might not have been present when investigators believed the crime occurred. Grant rubbed his forehead. "Why wasn't this used at trial?" Dana answered quietly. "The backup server wasn't reviewed. Everyone relied on the primary system logs, a simple oversight, or something larger. In death penalty cases, even small mistakes carry enormous consequences. Meanwhile, the legal process moved slowly, painfully slowly. The new claim could not instantly overturn anything. First, attorneys had to file a motion asking the court to consider the newly discovered evidence. Then prosecutors would respond. Then judges would decide whether the claim deserved a hearing. Each step required months, sometimes longer. This was the part of the justice system the public rarely saw. Paperwork battles fought in silence. Families waited. Lawyers argued through written briefs instead of dramatic courtroom speeches. And inmates counted days that felt identical. Inside death row, Elena followed a strict routine. Morning count, breakfast tray, 1 hour outside in a small enclosed yard. Reading, waiting. She spent most afternoons studying legal books borrowed from the prison library. Words like habeas corpus and constitutional review no longer confused her. She understood now why cases lasted decades. The system was designed to move carefully, slower than emotion, slower than anger, slower even than grief. One afternoon, another inmate asked her a question through the wall. "You really think appeals change anything?" Elena paused before answering. "I think they make people look twice." Outside the prison, media interest quietly returned. A small legal blog first reported the filing. Then regional newspapers picked up the story. Death row case reopened after evidence review. Soon, national outlets followed. Some commentators defended the original verdict. Others questioned whether pressure during the initial investigation had narrowed the focus too quickly. Detective Aaron Hale watched the coverage from his office television. He felt an uneasy pull in his chest. He remembered the long nights during the investigation, the confidence everyone felt once the evidence aligned, the relief of closing a difficult case. But now, he wondered what investigators might have missed. Hale requested access to old case materials, something he hadn't done in nearly a decade. When the boxes arrived, dust covered the edges. He opened them slowly. Photos, reports, interview transcripts, and one notebook he barely remembered writing. As he flipped through the pages, a memory surfaced, a witness who mentioned seeing a vehicle near the building earlier than expected. At the time, The details seemed unimportant. Now, it felt different. Hale circled the note with a pen. Questions began forming again. Months later, the appellate court made its decision. A hearing would be granted. Not a new trial yet, but a formal examination of the new evidence. For Elena, it meant leaving death row temporarily to appear in court again, something that rarely happened after sentencing. The courtroom looked smaller than she remembered. Fewer reporters, fewer spectators. But the tension felt heavier. Grant presented the updated timeline carefully, explaining how digital records could alter the sequence of events presented to jurors years earlier. Prosecutors argued the discrepancy was minor and did not change the overall evidence. Judges listened quietly, asking precise questions. No one raised their voice. No dramatic objections echoed through the room. Just careful examination, the slow machinery of justice turning again. During a recess, Detective Hale approached Grant cautiously. "I worked the original case," he said. Grant studied him. "You still believe the verdict was right?" Hale hesitated. "I believe we followed the evidence we had," he replied. "But I also believe evidence deserves another look." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't an apology. Just uncertainty. And uncertainty carries power inside a courtroom. Weeks passed after the hearing. Then came another development. Dana Liu discovered something unexpected while reviewing archived communications connected to the building's security company. An internal maintenance report mentioned a temporary system malfunction on the night of the crime, one that could have affected how timestamps were recorded. If true, both timelines might be partially wrong. Grant stared at the report in disbelief. "That means," Dana nodded slowly, "we may not actually know the exact timeline at all." The case was no longer about a small correction. It was about whether the foundation of the prosecution's timeline had ever been reliable. Grant immediately prepared a supplemental filing. But before it could be submitted, the prosecutor's office requested a private meeting. Inside a conference room, both sides sat across from each other for the first time since the original trial. The lead prosecutor spoke carefully. "If this evidence holds," she said, "we may need to reconsider portions of the case." Grant felt his pulse quicken. Reconsideration could mean many things. Sentence reduction, new sentencing hearing, or something far more dramatic. But nothing was certain yet, because the final decision rested with the court. Back in prison, Elena waited again. Days passed with no updates. She tried not to imagine outcomes. Hope remained dangerous. One evening, an officer stopped at her cell. "You've got legal mail coming tomorrow," he said casually. She nodded, pretending calm. But sleep never came that night. Across the state, Grant finalized the newest filing and sent it electronically just before midnight. Attached was the maintenance report, the timestamp analysis, and a statement from Detective Hale acknowledging unresolved timeline questions. Grant leaned back in his chair, exhausted. He knew what this filing asked the court to consider, not just a legal error, but the possibility that the jury had heard a version of events that might not have been fully accurate. Outside, city lights flickered as traffic moved through the streets, people living ordinary lives unaware of the decision now approaching. Days later, the court clerk entered a new update into the system. A judge had reviewed the emergency filing, and instead of scheduling another routine hearing, the judge issued an unexpected order, an evidentiary review, the rarest step yet. Grant read the notice twice, stunned, because an evidentiary review meant witnesses could be called again. Evidence could be challenged again, and under oath, investigators might need to explain how the timeline had been built in the first place. The past was no longer settled. It was reopening. Grant immediately called the prison. "Elena," he said when she answered, "the court wants to re-examine the evidence." Silence filled the line. "What does that mean?" she asked softly. Grant hesitated. "It means," he said carefully, "your case is no longer just an appeal." Outside the courthouse, reporters began gathering once more. Inside legal offices, attorneys prepared for battles thought finished years ago. And deep within the court system, a question now waited to be answered. A question powerful enough to change everything. If the timeline collapses, what else might fall with it? The evidentiary hearing was scheduled. Witnesses were being called, and for the first time since the sentence was announced, the possibility existed that the story everyone believed might not be the real one at all. The courtroom was silent long before the judge arrived. No cameras were allowed inside. No dramatic television coverage. An evidentiary hearing in a death penalty case almost never happened this late. Elena Marquez sat beside her attorney, hands folded calmly in front of her. Years on death row had taught her patience, but today felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, filled with expectation. Across the room, prosecutors organized folders stacked neatly like walls of paper. Everyone knew what was at stake. Not only a sentence, but trust in the investigation itself. The judge entered quietly. "All rise." The words echoed softly. Once seated, the judge spoke in an even tone. "This court will examine whether newly presented evidence materially affects the reliability of the original conviction." Simple words, enormous meaning. The hearing began. The first witness was Dana Liu. She explained how archived security data had been recovered years after the trial during a routine server migration. Using clear diagrams, she showed how the building's timekeeping system relied on synchronization signals that briefly failed on the night of the crime. When synchronization stops, she explained, timestamps may continue recording but inaccurately. She avoided technical jargon, speaking slowly so everyone understood. The prosecutor stood. "Are you saying the system was completely unreliable?" "No," Dana replied carefully. "I'm saying we cannot confirm the exact timing with certainty." That distinction mattered. The original case depended heavily on exact minutes. Now, those minutes were uncertain. Next came Detective Aaron Hale. He walked to the stand with measured steps. Older now than during the original trial. Grant approached gently. "Detective Hale, during the investigation, how important was the timeline?" "It was central," Hale answered. "It helped narrow our suspect list." "And if the timeline was inaccurate?" Hale paused. The courtroom seemed to lean forward. "Then," he said slowly, "some investigative conclusions may need reconsideration." A quiet murmur spread through the room before the judge called for silence. The prosecutor questioned Hale next, emphasizing the additional evidence presented at trial: witness statements, circumstantial connections, behavioral analysis. Hale agreed those elements existed, but when asked whether investigators had alternative timelines available at the time, he answered honestly, "No, we believe the system records were precise." Believed, not confirmed. During a break, reporters rushed outside to share updates. Headlines appeared online within minutes. Death row case faces major evidence challenge. Public attention returned quickly. Legal analysts debated the meaning of the hearing. Some argued the conviction remained strong. Others said the uncertainty alone justified deeper review. For Elena, none of that mattered. She watched quietly from a holding room, listening only to the steady ticking of a wall clock. Time, the very thing now under question, felt louder than ever. The most unexpected moment came on the second day. Grant called a witness no one anticipated, a former technician from the security company. The man explained that maintenance logs showed repeated synchronization failures during that month, not just one night. Was this disclosed during the original investigation? The prosecutor objected briefly, but documents confirmed the logs had existed at the time. They simply were never reviewed. The courtroom fell still, because the case was no longer about interpretation. It was about missing information. Closing arguments arrived sooner than anyone expected. Grant stood slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse investigators of wrongdoing. Instead, he spoke about certainty. "A death sentence requires confidence beyond doubt," he said. "Today, we have learned that the timeline presented to the jury, the framework holding the case together, may not have been reliable." He paused. "This hearing is not about blame. It is about accuracy." The prosecutor followed, reminding the court that juries consider many forms of evidence, not just timestamps. "The conviction reflected the totality of the case," she argued, "not a single data point." Both arguments carried weight. Both sounded reasonable. Days turned into weeks. Legal teams waited. Reporters speculated. Inside prison walls, Elena returned to routine once more: meals, counts, quiet evenings. But something had changed. Officers spoke to her differently now. Not with certainty, but curiosity. As if her future was suddenly unknown again. One morning, Before sunrise, Grant received a notification from the court system. A decision had been filed. His hands shook slightly as he opened the document. 23 pages, carefully written, measured. The judge acknowledged the seriousness of the new evidence and the importance of accurate timelines in the original prosecution. The ruling stated that confidence in portions of the timeline had been significantly weakened. Grant read faster, then stopped. He read the final paragraph again and again. He immediately called the prison. "Elena," he said when she answered. There was a long silence before he spoke the words. "The court has vacated the death sentence." Elena closed her eyes. Not freedom, not yet. But the sentence was no longer active. The case would return to a lower court for reconsideration of punishment and possibly further review of the conviction itself. For the first time in years, execution was no longer looming over her. News spread quickly. Some people celebrated the decision as proof the appeal system worked. Others felt frustration, believing justice had already been decided years earlier. Families connected to the case faced renewed uncertainty. The legal process, designed to seek fairness, often reopened emotional wounds along the way. Detective Hale watched the announcement quietly on television. He didn't feel victory. He didn't feel defeat. Only reflection. Investigations are built by humans, he realized, and humans can miss things. What mattered was whether the system allowed correction when new truths appeared. Months later, Elena sat in a different courtroom again. No longer a death row inmate awaiting execution. Now defendant awaiting legal reconsideration. The future remained uncertain, but uncertainty also meant possibility. Outside the courthouse, sunlight reflected off glass buildings as people walked past, unaware of how many years of legal effort had led to this moment. The story that began with certainty had ended with questions, and perhaps that was the real purpose of the system, not to move fast. As Elena was escorted from the courtroom, reporters shouted questions she did not answer. She simply looked forward, because after years defined by waiting, one truth finally remained clear. The legal process after a death sentence is not an ending. It is a long, complicated search for certainty, a search that can last decades, change lives, and sometimes reveal that justice is not a single moment, but a journey that refuses to stop asking questions. Thanks for watching. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe for more crime documentary stories.